1 Samuel 17, beginning at verse 4 through to the end of verse 11. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistine's words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. As you've just heard the next part of that story, you can see that the story is starting to heat up. The narrative is starting to draw people in with the prospective battle between two nations and even between two people. 1 Samuel 17, certainly verses 4 through to 11, are a lot like UFC, sort of ancient history style. It's where you pit the two best warriors from a nation against one another, and to the victor go the spoils. And that is what is being set up here. But it's being set up in a mocking, ironic tone, because the sad reality is that Saul, as the leader of Israel, is sadly unable to fulfill his task as God's appointed warrior and ruler. And the people of Philistia know it, and they're rubbing it in. They've like appeared in the ring. They're shouting obscenities to God. They're shouting obscenities to Saul and Israel. They're rubbing it in because they believe that not only will Goliath be the victor, but all of Philistia will be the victor over Israel and get the spoils that they believe are their due. The early verses in our text today highlight the depth of nastiness between the two nations. It begins, if you have it in front of you, at verse 4 by saying, "A champion named Goliath." It literally means the man in between, that is in between Israel and the Philistines. He's come out. And therefore it highlights, will Saul come out? Will he be the man in between the Philistines and his own people? Will he be the protector, the warrior? Will he buffer the people from their enemies? And we'll get the answer very soon, won't we? And it's a sad reality. But in verse 4, it continues on with some interesting backdrop to our story. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. Now, the Philistine camp, as we know, had slowly moved its way into the region of Israel in the furthest that it's ever been. But Goliath himself, being from the town or the city of Gath, is from the place where, when they took the Ark of the Covenant after a victory they held in earlier in 1 Samuel, it's the city that suffered the most. And so, as he grows up, seeing his city suffer at the hands of the Israelite gods, and now he's given a chance to get his own back at them. Vengeance is sweet for Goliath, he thinks, at this point. But of course, he is being set up, as we know. But at this point, it looks like to the nation of Israel and to Saul, they are going to be on the receiving end of revenge that God himself took against the people of Gath. And they are wondering, who is going to go before us? Who is this man in between? And then it goes through his height and his weights and what he's wearing. And we're supposed to go, wow. Remember, if you look at a person from the outside, your response will be verse 11. Fear, fear, fear. Saul, he was chosen because he was a man of height, a man of grandeur, a man of handsomeness. He was chosen because his external appearance, they hoped, matched the internal reality of what they wanted the nation of Israel to be. The trouble is that internal reality didn't have God as the king. It had them as their own king, with Saul as the figurehead. And so they chose a person who looked good on the outside, but was vacuous inside himself. And so that becomes a metaphor for the nation. The opposite, sadly, is a bit true here for Goliath, Gath, and Philistia. They appear strong, robust, powerful from a human perspective. But on the inside, they're idolatrous. They don't worship God. And whilst the enemies of God look strong when we're opposed to them without God's strength, to God, one enemy is never more stronger than another. We're all equally weak in God's presence, and therefore we will be vanquished if we stand up against him. We need his help. Saul never called for God's help. And so this large description of the armor, for example, of Goliath, stands in contrast later to David's armor. But in reality, it stands in contrast to our own hearts, that when we look at the externals of people and make our judgments only based on them, without the eyes of God, without the character of God informing our decisions, we'll always make fear-driven, emotional, human-centered decisions. And never will they turn out for the glory of God or the betterment of ourselves. You can see it as we end here in verse 10 and 11. Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel." That he certainly is doing. "Give me a man and let us fight each other." That man should have been Saul, but he refuses to even come out from the nation of Israel. And hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites, that's those who are there with Saul, were dismayed and terrified. Without trusting in God, they trusted in themselves, trusted in their own ideas of good and strength and power, and realized they came up short against Goliath. But you see, they were never meant to come up against Goliath from their own strength. More upon that in the next couple of days. Amen.